In this video, we'll be talking about trapping semi-aquatic species including beaver, otter, muskrat, and mink trapping. We'll look at different approaches and techniques to avoid accidental captures. In the case of beaver, we'll be talking mainly about the risk of capturing dogs when trapping on land with lure. We'll show how to avoid this bad situation. Otherwise, all the techniques recommended are underwater to avoid this kind of problem. When using bait to trap mink, we also run the risk of capturing raccoons and domestic cats accidentally or illegally. And then, in the case of muskrat, what's most hazardous are traps set on floats, especially if bait is visible. This can attract various bird species, so we're going to show how to avoid this kind of situation. The trapping technique we're going to look at is very common. It is what's known as the bottom edge technique. Effectively, we use stream bank edges and places where there has been erosion by the current. As you can see here, there's a nice strip of land running alongside this big stone, and here there's a travel corridor. So I'm lifting the vegetation a little. Normally the water should come up to about this level. The technique is simple, it's just a brick and the trap. With a small piece of rope and 2 snap hooks, you attach this with the brick and the trap. So for these techniques, you need a good level of water. We're going to use a 1/10 size type trap because we have to position the trap next to the wall. We simply position the brick on the spring to stabilize the trap. The vegetation is then lowered. This is really a technique without lure or bait, so no other species will travel this corridor except for mink and muskrat. Well, the technique shown here uses a trap box. It's often used for mink. The risk with this set is that it requires bait, which can attract non-target species. For example, domestic cats, especially if you're in an inhabited area. It can also be a risk for raccoons. So one way of avoiding this situation is to modify the original box, a conventional box. We'll use either a board of an appropriate width or plywood. A hole is cut in the center. This hole is combined with a box that is closed at the back, so there's no mesh at the back of this box. It's a solid box. We're going to camouflage this box. It's going to look like a natural hole, almost like a muskrat's den, so the mink will be able to get in there with confidence with the scent of bait and all that. And because the opening is so small, there's no risk of domestic cats or raccoons getting inside. In the end, there's no access to the trap to trigger it. Another selective technique we use are trail sets. No bait is used here. We catch the animals passing through. We have 2 natural passes here in the tall grass. When you bend over at the animal's level, you can clearly see the travel paths. So all you have to do is set a double spring trap at that point as you're on the ground. This is really very effective for mink. No bait, so no risk of catching domestic cats or raccoons. It's really a very selective trapping technique that I highly recommend for efficiency and safety. When it comes to trapping beavers and otters, it is most important to be careful when setting on land, especially if you use a lure that could attract a dog nearby. So we prefer to use sets in the water, underwater, like here, in a channel near a beaver lodge. Then we're supported by the watercourse. We position a log with a system of 3 nails. The trap is then suspended below. Now there is ice, but when set in open water, a swimming beaver would see the floating log, dive under it and become captured in the trap. So these sets are certainly very safe and avoid accidental captures. We're on an active beaver dam at the dam spillway, a very good site for beavers. And when a beaver colony is captured, well, it's a good idea to stick around for the otter. The only thing to bear in mind is that if you're trapping outside the trapping season for beaver damage control purposes, you're going to avoid using this type of set out of season because you can capture otter at a time when it's not targeted. Then now, float sets for muskrat. Ideally, no bait is used, especially in spring. You simply place a piece of dried muskrat gland or a gland-based lure in that spot. This will avoid attracting birds to the site. It's always a good idea to use a protection system above the trap because ducks often tend to climb onto floating objects. So if a duck tries to get onto this board here, it'll come up against this wire here and then change its course. It won't connect with the trap. If we put a bait simply positioned here, it's the same principle. It can attract other types of birds to come and eat from the bait. Always use this protective wire to avoid unintended catches. We could use the same model of float with a 120 size type trap fixed with 3 nails. On the same principle, we won't use bait, especially on the trigger, as this is very dangerous for catching birds. Instead, we'll use a gland-based scent lure located behind the trap.